I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Jacob Mchangama. He is CEO of Justitia and author of the new book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you so much.
You are based in Copenhagen, and you are in closer proximity to this new axis of totalitarianism. It doesn't really matter what direction you look, right? You could be looking at the democratic standoff in Pakistan right now. You could be looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But there seems to be an increasing destabilization of democratic order. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity from the outset to reflect on that.
Yeah, I think there's what I would call a free speech recession. You can see it both in the data. So if you're a geek, you can look at all the data sets. They point very clearly to the effect that, freedom of the media, freedom of expression is in decline across the board. And of course, you can find any number of anecdotal evidence from, people being arrested for protesting the war in Russia, to foreign media being thrown out. Unfortunately, it's one thing that authoritarian states crack down on free speech. That's worrying in and of itself, but it's not particularly surprising. That has been the 101 for authoritarian states since for 2,500 years throughout the history of free speech. What I am particularly worried about in this moment is that liberal democracies, open democracies, seem also to have lost sort of their faith in free speech and have increasingly come to see free speech in the digital age as being weaponized against democracy itself. And so here in Europe, you see an increasing tendencies for democracies to legislate restrictions on free speech. And in the US, where the First Amendment provides very strong constitutional protection of free speech, you see the culture of free speech being attacked from both the left and the right.
Just before we dive into the question of speech under assault or scrutiny in democratized societies or semi-democratized societies, I just want to follow up with you on the question of autocratic repressive regimes where free speech is not possible, or certainly not possible in the same platforms or mediums it is where you are in Copenhagen, in the UK, elsewhere in Europe, or in the US. I mean, more than the question that you raise about free speech being diminished in under democratic rule, mm-hmm. Are you more concerned just as a broader framework of the fact that there's less and less actual democratic rule around the world?
Yeah, I think those two trends unfortunately go hand in hand because, but you're absolutely right in pointing at the fact, if we go back 10 or 15 years, everyone was very optimistic about the internet changing the rules of the game. So good old-fashioned censorship would be sort of consigned to the ash heap of history, and totalitarian, authoritarian states would no longer be able to control the public sphere. But look at China. China now has created perhaps the most efficient censorship machine in the world, and increasingly authoritarian states have learned to sort of reverse engineer the internet and social media to serve their interests. And if you're a dissident or a journalist in an authoritarian state, you need the internet, you need social media to circumvent official propaganda and censorship. And unfortunately, authoritarians have learned to rig the game. You can even see, today we're speaking, and yesterday Viktor Orban won the election in Hungary, and he is someone who has very much controlled the public sphere and limited the ability of independent journalists to operate there. So that's a very worrying trend.
Of course, I do want to talk to you about speech, and you're an evangelist for
Yeah.
free speech. I want to talk to you about it from the context of where you are today in Copenhagen, and also from the EU and US perspective. But I can't help but just hearing the synopsis of our conversation so far and think back on this projection, or at least this fantasy about the end of history. And of course, Fukuyama says he's misunderstood, misinterpreted, and that may well be. And he's certainly, still very clear-eyed about where we are now. But things seem to be, maybe as a result of the pandemic, exacerbating trends. But whether it's Hungary, you mentioned China, there doesn't really, in certain countries like China and Russia, there's not even really the vehicle for that expression to take place. There aren't real political opponents. There aren't, newspapers that are doing muckraking and challenging authorities in power. And then in places like Pakistan or India, and now you mentioned Hungary as well, that there it's very, very dangerous to be that gadfly or to challenge the party line. And at least in the countries that I just mentioned, there was an aspirational hope. And you, as a defender of freedom and a human rights lawyer, understand this. There was an aspiration in every single one of the countries I just mentioned 10 years ago that things would be different, and different as in better, not worse.
But maybe we also in the West, perhaps we were too optimistic, because it turns out, and we can even see that in Western societies, that freedom is not enough to satisfy the human psychology. We also have an urge to belong, to identity, and sometimes those values clash, and unfortunately, at least from sort of the liberal point of view, these values can clash violently, and sometimes the aspiration of freedom is then relegated beyond the needs for security, identity, belonging, and that is something that we see in a number of these countries. You mentioned India. India, of course, the world's largest democracy, but increasingly becoming a very illiberal democracy, where if you have opinions that differ from the ruling party, then you're in danger. If you're a religious minority, then you better watch what you say, and that unfortunately is a global trend.
I think it's important to make the distinction, now that we've covered this ground, that that's not what's happening in the U.S. in terms of the chilling effect of autocracy, and autocracy sort of being what is animating the free speech, censorship, regulation debate. It's not that particular parties or opposition to the government are being less receptive in our, or less well received. If you're a Labour Party member in the UK and you want to attack the Prime Minister on policy grounds, or even not policy grounds, you still can do that. In where you are in Denmark, you can do that with the leadership. In the US, when Trump was president, you could do that. When Biden is president today, you can do that. So there's a specific kind of concern you have about illiberal attitudes towards speech, but how is it manifesting? Because it's not manifesting in the sort of thou not speak unfavorably about the presiding government.
No, you're absolutely right. In many ways, I think the constitutional legal protection afforded to free speech under the First Amendment in the US is probably the strongest protection of free speech ever in the history of humankind. Go back 100 years in the US, a bit more than 100 years, and you could be thrown in prison for 10 or 20 years for opposing American involvement in World War I in pamphlets. That would certainly not fly today under the current interpretation of the First Amendment. So you don't have to worry about saying things about the president. What I see mostly under pressure in the U.S. is what I would call the culture of free speech. And from looking at the history of free speech, it's my thesis is that ultimately the culture of free speech is more important than what the law says. So the First Amendment was ratified in 1791. But if in 1798, you could actually go to jail if you criticized President John Adams. The First Amendment has not changed, but today you can say just about anything about President Biden, and no one will throw you in jail or even dream of prosecuting you. But instead, there's intolerance, I would say, on both sides that have to do with identity. So there's one mostly on the left that has a concern about minorities, for instance, who view free speech and the exercise thereof by bigots as a threat to minorities, whereas the history of the U.S., in my opinion at least, shows that it's very much the other way around. Free speech has been a very, very potent weapon for all kinds of oppressed groups and minorities, not least, African Americans when it came to abolitionism, when it came to the civil rights movement. So one of the reasons why the First Amendment enjoys such a strong protection is because the civil rights movement won a number of landmark First Amendment cases. New York Times versus Sullivan, which is one of the landmark cases that provides very, very strong protection for the media, for instance, when writing critical stuff about public officials, is a civil rights era case. And on the other hand, you see this tsunami of laws from in Republican-dominated states aimed at so-called critical race theory, which is, I would say, a conservative attempt to establish some kind of orthodoxy in the sphere of education, and not only sort of K-12, but even in colleges and universities. Right. And I think that the problem with this is that it's eating away at the core of free speech from each side. So hollowing out the tolerance, the civic tolerance, which ultimately is the necessary precondition for a strong commitment to free speech.
I'm so glad you pointed out that in the era of Adams and Jefferson, the Alien and Sedition Acts actually operated in that fashion, that for the first decade and maybe more of America, there were, actually, there was deployment of the law in that fashion to penalize and bar speech from political opponents, but it gradually simmered to an era of debate and periodicals that were going to be sharing all perspectives, and no one was going to be jailed as a consequence of those perspectives. You mentioned this question of speech now as a kind of cultural phenomenon and how we think about it, and whether we are at all shrinking the population of speech. I said I wanted to ask you about how it is in Denmark and broadly in Europe. We know there are more restrictions on curbing dis and misinformation in Europe, but this whole mantra of Americana, born out of our experience of the First Amendment, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. How do you think of that from the perspective of Denmark and Europe, and then from the perspective of America? Is that still the way we should be thinking of speech?
Well, free speech, I think all great thinkers of free speech, philosophers and legal scholars have acknowledged that free speech comes with harms and costs. So there are consequences of speech. Obviously, speech, can lead to bad things. It would be impossible to organize a genocide without speech. However, my reading of history is very much that that it does not necessarily follow that because free speech can sometimes lead to bad consequences, restrictions and censorship is an efficient remedy. So very often the cure is worse than the disease. And we also undermine the degree to which speech can actually be used to counter bad phenomenon. But it's a fantasy to think that there won't be bad consequences from speech. January 6th, the attack on the Capitol would not have happened without speech and social media. I think that's a given. There were things that the FBI and others could have done to beef up security if they had taken more seriously what was written by a lot of people on social media. But obviously speech was helped motivate those people who attacked and tried to impede the peaceful transfer of power in America. So we have to be clear about that. But then if you look at history, so one of the reasons why in Europe we tend to regulate extreme speech such as hate speech much more vigorously than in America is because we have agreed that the Holocaust and the rise of Nazism happened partly because the Nazis were allowed to contest democratic elections and publish newspapers. But what I show in the book is that in the Weimar Republic in Germany, actually speech of Nazis and others was heavily circumscribed. So and the Nazis used the censorship and restrictions of their speech very cleverly to sort of what we today call the Streisand effect, sort of painting themselves as martyrs and to create more publicity around themselves. So someone like Joseph Goebbels, who later became propaganda minister, started a Nazi newspaper, and he bragged about how often he was administratively banned from publishing this newspaper. And ultimately, the Nazis used the emergency measures of the Weimar Constitution that allowed the president to suspend free speech and other civil liberties. They used those provisions that were supposed to protect democracy. They used those to abolish democracy and within a very short period create a totalitarian one-party state. So I'm very skeptical of, even though I acknowledge that free speech comes with harms and costs, and no one can guarantee that the benefits will always be outweigh the harms. I tend to think that they actually do from a democratic point of view.
That is cogent and clear-eyed, and we just can't deny the fact that whether it's the insurrection or genocide, it comes about as a result of some organizing of speech. And in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it came about through Orwellian speech, through a revisionist understanding of history. I mean, revisionist is putting it too politely. I mean, the notion of the Jewish Ukrainian president representing anti-Semitism or Nazism, and so how do you grapple with that when it's not even hate speech in its kind of vindictive or ad hominem form, but it's just a completely fictionalized version of history?
Yeah, but look, that kind of speech, which seems to have hypnotized way too many Russians, could only have that effect in a country like Russia, which is dominated by propaganda and censorship. So I don't want to take the comparison between Trump and Putin too far because that would not be serious. But Trump during his presidency often fantasized about cracking down on the enemies of the people that he described independent media, locking up his opponents. He was powerless to do so. Why was he powerless to do so? Because you have a First Amendment, because you have independent institutions. You had a free media which could, debunk some of his, some of the fantasies and policies and his Twitter account. In Russia, you don't have those same mechanisms, and so Putin has been in power for 20 years or so. All the while, journalists have been killed, journalists have been imprisoned, laws have been adopted against extremism that have shut down human rights organizations, control of social media platforms, and someone like Alexei Navalny, who was maybe the most serious opposition figure, was first poisoned, and then when he, very bravely returned to Russia, thrown in jail, and he's been given a couple of sentences on top of that. So that kind of propaganda, which stirs a nation into sort of revanchist, authoritarian, aggressive invasion, I think is only possible in a country where you don't have free speech, where you have that vicious cocktail of official propaganda and very heavy-handed censorship that you unfortunately have in Russia. I think it would be very, very difficult to have the same dynamic play out in a liberal democracy. I wouldn't say it's impossible.
But you're saying it's becoming increasingly possible with, for example, on the right, Republicans who attack critical race theory, but it's really a Trojan horse for eliminating the teaching of racism or white supremacy, right? I mean, that is a concern. That is a concern. But
the good thing is that I'm not an expert on the First Amendment, but it would seem to me, at least, that the laws that try to impose some kind of orthodoxy on colleges and universities and public institutions would run afoul of the First Amendment.
Well, it's happening. It is happening, though. It's happening.
Sure, it's happening. But I know. But I would imagine that ACLU and other organizations would be challenging those bills in court. But then you also have from the other side, you have an attempt to sort of police speech in cultural institutions, not through laws, but by trying to deplatform people, saying, people should not have a right to speak at universities. University professors should be fired if they wrote something offensive in a tweet, or, the New York Times should not run a provocative op-ed by a Republican, prominent Republican politician, and that also eats away at the culture of free speech. Also, because the definition of what is offensive or racist and bigoted seem to be undergoing sort of scope creep, and then it becomes where are the red lines, and that in itself can help internalize self-censorship in the very institutions that are crucial for that pluralism, for that for giving room to that tolerance and pluralism and criticism that is the lifeblood of democracy. So that's why I think
in the minutes we have left, and we only have a few minutes, but doesn't it make a difference who's doing the regulating, whether it's the state or a private institution? Because I was mentioning University of Florida, and of course, Florida public schools that are now subject to the new law about, not mentioning homosexuality or teaching about gay people, basically, up to a certain point. But, where do you draw the line, having studied this history and just chronicled it from Socrates to the present? Because we live in, like you said, in a culture where Georgetown University can make its own decision about someone it just hired who remarked that there aren't many qualified Black women jurists for the Supreme Court, right? I mean, he said basically, how could you choose only from this group that's less qualified? Yeah. And so, like, Georgetown is undergoing its own review process, and I wonder, in your estimation, if that's different from the state of Florida taking action.
Yeah, of course it's different. But what I argue is that even though one can run into problems under the First Amendment and might run into legal problems, the culture of free speech is also extremely important. So if you read, some of the prophets of free speech, like John Stuart Mill, he worried as much about the tyranny of the majority as he did about the tyranny of the magistrate. If you read Alexis de Tocqueville on his Democracy in America, he says, Americans could never dream about adopting laws that restricted free speech. Not exactly true, but more or less right. But he said, if you cross the lines of the majority, then you'll be subject to persecution. And of course, we have, if you go back in time, you will see a lot of people also, minorities, if you were someone like Ida B. Wells, who documented lynchings in the South, it would not necessarily be the state that came after you, but it would be, white newspapers that incited to persecution or violence, or just made you infamous, or someone like Frederick Douglass who was heckled at an abolitionist meeting. So that history in itself also undermines the culture of free speech.
We have 60 seconds, but the question for you is, what about that cancel culture question in Europe, and specifically where you are in Copenhagen? I mean, that question of a tyranny, a tyranny of the majority, or in some cases, a tyranny that wants to impose a kind of ethical barometer or standard in conversation.
I think, ironically, our legal restrictions on free speech are more restrictive than in the US, but I would say that when it comes to discussions at university and in the media, our cultural institutions, we have more room for speech that would be off limits in the US due for cultural reasons.
And how would you describe that kind of speech?
Well, I'd like to take the best from Denmark. I'd like to have our sort of culture of free speech and the American First Amendment. Then, we'd be set and everything would be rosy.
Rosy. Well, that's a more positive way to conclude our conversation, Jacob. I really do appreciate your insight on free speech, and encourage our viewers and our listeners to check out your new book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. Really appreciate your time today, Jacob.
Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure.
Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Ganz Cooney, Lawrence B. Benenson, the Angelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, JoAnn and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.